The ecological crisis of the world is causing very strong anxiety, difficult emotions and mental states. Fundamentally, anxiety and worry may be adaptive and important reactions. They lead us to think about our behavior and to search for more information, but if they become very strong.
It's amazing. You're here all the way from Finland. You're a professor at the University of Helsinki. You won so many awards. You're known as the leading scholar in Finland for eco-anxiety research. And at the same time, internationally, everyone knows you as the expert in eco-emotional studies, right?
Well, yeah, many people who work on the field know me, and it's a growing field, but it took a long time for it to start growing.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I read last month in the BBC, it said how Finland has topped the world's happiest country for the 8th year running. So I have a feeling that your work and this research must have something to do with it. Resolving.
Well, one never knows, and there's a lot of good things in the Nordic countries, of which Finland is part of. But of course, we have our share of problems also. And sometimes when the results of these happiness studies come out, Finns are asking that we wonder how happy the rest are.
Yeah, so can you tell us, before we jump in, a little more about your work? What do you do? And how do you contribute?
Yes, so I'm based in Helsinki, the capital of Finland, and what I do is interdisciplinary environmental research, focusing on emotions about environmental issues. I have a long history of studying religion and environment, and I did my dissertation on that topic. I have been working also in practice with religious communities and with environmental education, and my work with eco-emotions had led me to many kinds of cooperations with different people, including artists and educators and people from the social and health sectors and so on. So it's been a rich journey and also slightly unusual for a scholar. So I'm not a full-time academic because I'm doing both research and then many of these practical things.
Amazing. I love that. So tell us, what is eco-anxiety? How is it showing up these days in Finland and abroad?
So the ecological state of the world, which might be called ecological crisis in brief, is causing many kinds of impacts. Some of them are physical and some of them are psychological. And the term eco-anxiety has been growingly used, especially since 2017, for difficult emotions and mental states linked with the ecological crisis. It's almost synonymous with eco-distress or ecological distress, and that term also refers to difficult feelings and mental states. And what I've tried to do a lot in my research is to show how complex and multifaceted this phenomenon is. There are people who feel stronger anxiety or distress, especially at times, but for most people, there's fluctuations in these feelings and mental states. So, for example, it's very common that sometimes one feels more anxiety and distress and worry, and then during other times in life, more mildly or moderately. And I think it's important that we are able to situate a wide variety of these phenomena under the same phenomenon. But of course, that then requires certain attention to detail when we are talking about the phenomenon. So it's quite a different thing to talk about very strong anxiety symptoms because of the ecological crisis and other things in life. Or if we are talking about people feeling some kind of anxiety and worry, which then usually is related to thinking about what one should do in relation to environmental issues. So fundamentally, anxiety and worry may be very adaptive and important reactions, exactly because they lead us to think about our behavior and to search for more information. But if they become very strong, then they can be paralyzing, and that's of course a problem. And surveys and other research about eco-anxiety and distress shows that difficult emotions are felt by people all around the world. Young people are one prominent group, which is logical because they have the life ahead of them, and often when you are young, you are quite sensitive to ethical problems in the world, and there's many reasons why young people and young adults report lots of these feelings. But also folks from other age groups, and if one has strong environmental values or strong environmental identity, that is usually linked to being much concerned about what's happening, and that may then give rise to distress also. And research on this topic is growing in various places. We still need much more information, and it's difficult because if one uses only survey methods, then we have to rely on people self-recognizing what they are feeling and why. And it may not be easy for people to recognize what they exactly are feeling and what are the causes of those feelings. So survey methods can include large numbers of people and they give important information, but we must also be critical about the research and use other kinds of methods to study the phenomenon.
Yeah, and I would think that people, when they're so in the throes of anxiety, they can, like you say, easily not even recognize it. Or when they take the survey, they're feeling happy in that moment. So then they forget all of everything else. So how do you work with that when you are doing research with others, when you are talking to others? And just yesterday, for example, they have a major anxiety attack. They're freaking out. But today, they see you, they feel happy, they say, oh, Panu is here, everything is fine.
Yes, it's true that people's moods can change rapidly, and sometimes there can be these vicious circles or loops between phenomena. And it's a very difficult condition if one starts to feel anxious about feeling anxious, for example. So certain kinds of situations then can seem very threatening and so on. And of course, in practice, many people in various countries have tried to develop methods to support people who feel eco-distress or anxiety. And there, many kinds of methods have been used, ranging from psychoeducation about things that one can do to calm down one's nervous system and manage stronger states of anxiety, for example, then extending to other kinds of emotion regulation, because so many other emotions can also be involved. For example, feelings of guilt and feelings of sadness or feelings of anger and so on. So often people benefit from getting resources to engage with specific emotions also. So sometimes that can give good resources for ways forward.
Yeah, and talking about emotions, I know you created the climate emotions wheel. And everyone I know in America, all the psychotherapists that I have met use that. So tell us a little bit about that. How did you come up with that? How did you and your team develop even this concept?
Yes, so in psychology in general, emotion wheels have been used for a long time. Robert Polucik is one prominent psychologist who has a rather wide-ranging emotion wheel. I've published 2 books on eco-emotions in Finnish, one more about eco-anxiety and hope in 2017, and a second one about a broader array of eco-emotions in 2019. And I then started thinking about doing an emotion wheel about eco-emotions, but it's a complex thing to do because there's difficult selections to be made about what to include. One would like to keep the wheel simple enough so that it can be easily used, but also nuanced enough so that it doesn't leave important things out. And then came COVID-19 and so on, and I ended up not finishing that project. But then I got an email in 2023 from an organization called Climate Mental Health Network, and I heard that they are planning to do a climate emotions wheel, and they had found my research and asked for my advice on the matter. And that way I became part of the working team, and my research article called Toward a Taxonomy of Climate Emotions was quite heavily used as a foundation for the wheel. Anja Kamenets, a journalist who is nowadays working mostly with climate emotions and climate psychology, was leading that working group and did important work there. And emotion wheels are very useful because they can give people names and visualizations of emotions. And very often people are themselves surprised about what kinds of emotions they actually are feeling or connect with when they take a look to wheels like these. And we've been very happy about the popularity of the climate emotions wheel. It's now been translated into more than 35 languages, and folks are using it in various places, as you mentioned. So that's a source of joy also. And on the web page of Climate Mental Health Network, there's many exercises and activities, and also an empty wheel exercise, which I think is very important because one may feel also other things than what is shown in the wheel. And it's important that people can also use other words and perhaps words from their own language to describe what they are feeling.
How does that work, Panu? How do people use that? The empty wheel and the one that's not empty?
Well, sort of standard way of using it is to ask people to look at it and then to reflect on what they recognize feeling of those emotions in the wheel. And sometimes if there is difficulties to go into deeper self-reflection, or especially talking about those emotions with others, it always requires a safe space to show vulnerability, for example. Then the discussion can be more generally about what kind of emotions have you recognized that people may feel in relation to climate matters. So there's a sort of one step of distance then between the personal experience and the subject matter, which brings more safety. Some people have printed the wheel and put it in some kind of public space, for example, the hallway of a school or a retreat center, and then some physical objects that people can put next to the wheel. For example, post-it papers where they write things, or then pebbles or stones next to certain emotion words. And that's an important element of testifying publicly that people have many kinds of emotions about these issues. So at its best, it can include self-knowledge, but also empathy towards oneself and towards others. And of course, when thinking about it even more broadly, if it helps people's emotional energies to flow more freely, that will then have effects on well-being and functionality and behavior also.
Yeah, I loved how you say put it somewhere public, put like a post-it note or something. In the past, I used to take these wheels and just kind of spam places with it, just put it places. But I never thought about the post-it note, so I hope people can do that. That would be so beneficial. So tell us, what's the difference with this climate emotions wheel and the one that has been used for decades prior?
The one developed by Plutchik has a sort of axial structure in the sense that he tried to put emotions and kind of counter emotions on opposite sides of the wheel. So, for example, joy and sadness are on different sides of the wheel. And then there's some sort of further emotions linked with these. And the structure works to a certain extent, but then, reality is so complicated that it's very difficult to do comprehensive logical models of it. And I think that's as useful as Plutchik's wheel is, the axial structure doesn't work in all places. In the climate emotions wheel, there is no axial structure, although sadness and a vaguely named positivity section are opposite each other. So that may give some people the impression that there is some kind of emotion and counter emotion dynamic here, but that's not really the intention. There's some colors linked both with Plutchik's wheel and the climate emotions wheel, and that's also not a systematic approach in the climate emotions wheel. And we recognize that in different cultures, different colors have different symbolic meanings. And for example, in many cultures, the color red is associated with anger, but not in all countries. And sometimes it might be a worthwhile, interesting, creative exercise to think about what kind of colors come to people's minds when thinking about a certain emotion, or then combinations of emotions. There is a document called Climate Emotions Guide also on the website of Climate Mental Health Network that I wrote with support from Anja Kamenets. And there's reflection questions about these emotions, and also some discussion of emotion dynamics, such as mixed emotions or interlaced emotions. And when we think of climate change, very often people have these combinations of emotions or movement from one emotion to another. And of course, being aware of that can be very helpful. For example, there may also be emotion norms which are culturally shaped and socially shaped, and religion and spirituality may have a role in that also. And that can result sometimes also in gendered emotion norms. To mention an example, in places like Finland, it's been prominent that boys have been taught that a real man shouldn't cry in public, which then causes complications in relation to sadness and the positive functions of sadness. And it has been taught that a good girl is not angry in public, which then again causes complications in relation to anger and defending one's boundaries and working against injustice and so on. And I've seen this dynamic then happening also in the context of eco-emotions or climate emotions. For example, a woman starting to feel angry about climate injustice, but then starting to feel shamed of feeling that anger in public because she has been socialized into thinking and feeling that a girl or woman shouldn't be angry in public. So sometimes realizing these trajectories between emotions can help people to dismantle these kinds of problematic dynamics of how and where they are feeling things. And the metaphor of color sometimes I think is fascinating in this regard. So thinking about what colors and what emotions they depict are combined in our experiences and how they change and so on. So this whole area of creative engagement I think is very useful.
Conditioning, it seems so strong in our society. I know in the United States, we also have that certain roles we must play based on gender. And all it does, it seems, to create oppression within others. So I'm curious, when you work with others in Finland, or you work with people from abroad, Panu, how do you address emotions that have been buried for so long, unexpressed?
Yes, thank you for voicing that. And I have training and experience in counseling, And for example, when I worked with religious communities, in this case, Christian congregations, I was counseling people who felt grief due to bereavement and so on. So I have that experience, but of course I also recognize that I'm not a fully trained psychotherapist, for example. So in the workshops I'm leading, I try to avoid situations where people would go so deep that there would be a lot of support then needed. And if certain fundamental important things are taken care of in the group setting, for example, that there's enough safety and there's sort of jointly approved rules for working together and there's different kinds of support structures available, then my experience is that these situations are usually very useful for people. And then facilitators, of course, must be aware that there may be surprises coming up, but usually there is enough containment and support in the groups. For guidance about various situations in this kind of work, the guidebook by Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown called Coming Back to Life, the guide to the work that reconnects, is highly useful. So there's different kinds of dynamics covered and also sort of emergency situation instructions that if somebody starts to wander into difficult mental states, what to do to sort of wake up the person and do something which is grounding and so on. And Joanna Macy, of course, Buddhist systems thinker and workshop leader and many things, has been highly influential for all kinds of methods related to how we feel about the world. And Molly Young Brown, a psychologist and therapist, has been also developing many highly useful methods for this kind of work.
What was the biggest surprise you received in group or in your work? And how did you overcome that?
That's a fascinating question. There has been many surprises. What comes to my mind now first is not a sort of crisis situation, but rather an example of sort of transformative learning and surprise, which is a workshop I was using a method called the spectrum line of eco-emotions. The instructions are freely available in my blog, and they are also discussed in this recent book called Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. So that method includes people moving along an invisible line in the space, where on one end is feeling a certain emotion strongly or very often, and on the other end of the line is feeling that emotion not so often or not so strongly. And then with necessary guidelines, people are asked to take an embodied position in relation to one emotion at a time in the context of the ecological crisis or climate crisis. And then when people take that position, they are asked to reflect with a person close to them and then going into joint discussion and the facilitator providing some points perhaps and then moving on to next emotion. So when doing that kind of work, for example, there was this instance when a young woman in relation to anger found it very difficult to take the position and then ended up taking the position close to the not feeling it so often or strongly. And then later on, when the line was then about grief, after discussing with the person close to her, and so she remarked that now I'm actually feeling a connection to my anger. And of course, that was a splendid result of the method, leading to this kind of discovery that there is the potential for anger and constructive anger, and sometimes the path towards that may go via being able to connect with sadness and grief.
Constructive anger. This is such an important topic these days. What's the difference between constructive anger and for lack of better words, the anger that majority of people maybe feel or express? How can harmful, destructive anger become constructive anger?
Fundamentally, all kinds of emotions give important information and may guide our body minds towards important aims. But of course, then a lot of complications can happen. And in many cultures and also many religions, such as Christianity and Buddhism, there is a challenge of connecting with this constructive anger dimension, partly because there has been, understandably so, warnings about aggressive anger or toxic anger and being too angry and perhaps violent. So that is, of course, something which needs to be contained. But then those people who have been suffering from many kinds of injustices have rightfully raised up the importance of anger if there are injustices. So I think that's a profound challenge for people living with various privileges to remember that there may be very good causes for anger and moral outrage. And then how to sort of cherish constructive anger and not those toxic and more dangerous forms of that. In an ideal case, that of course starts from early childhood, collectively teaching children that, okay, what you now feel is anger, and you seem to be feeling it because you feel that some kind of boundary has been breached, or there's a danger that somebody is doing something that you feel is unjust, and then sort of teaching that it's okay actually to feel these feelings and that it's possible to control that state. And there's some very interesting embodied methods for that. For example, the emotion coach Carla McLaren recommends as one method, imagining the space around you, sort of your aura, and then mentally letting the energy of anger flow around you and circle around you, but at the same time realizing that you don't have to push that energy outwards or throw it against anyone. You can just let it swirl around you, for example. So, and that's an example of being able to feel that energy, but also being able to control it to the extent that you are not doing anything rash or violent. So these are a couple of examples, both from early childhood and then as adults, of methods that people can learn to use so that we don't cut ourselves off from this energy, but we don't also become just consumed by it. And social media is one example of a place where I've seen very little constructive anger. It's so difficult to communicate emotions in a constructive way in social media. So personally, I don't usually try to do that.
Yeah, especially the young people now, many don't want to talk on the phone. They don't want to be face to face. They just write, text, do social media, and then project their own experiences onto what is being said, the tone, the voice, everything else.
Yeah, it's too easy to imagine all sorts of things if the communication is only textual, or then, as you say, to project something from yourself to the situation or to the words of another.
So you do a lot of work with spirituality, and throughout this conversation, you mentioned Christianity and Buddhism. Tell us about, what does that look like? Is there a bridge, or is there a contemplative practice or two that you can recommend for the listeners or the viewers to work with their emotions constructively?
Thanks for asking about that also. And one of my papers last year deals with engaging with climate grief, guilt, and anger in religious communities. And most universally that discusses Christian and Buddhist communities also in that article. So there's more information and tips in that open access article than what I can mention here. But depending on the situation, there might be various kinds of challenges and opportunities here. For guilt and shame, which are so prevalent in relation to ecological and climate issues. And on one hand, there may be important energies and information in them also, but on the other hand, there's the great possibility that people take too much of those emotions, and then that leads to various kinds of problematic reactions and behavior. Either, for example, defending oneself aggressively because the guilt and shame feel to be too much, or then becoming overly depressed, or trying sort of eternally to achieve and still feeling inadequate because there is just so much that needs to be done in the world. And for those kinds of situations, I think that the work of Tara Brach, for example, is highly useful. Both the RAIN method of sort of observing and working with emotions, and this attention to what she calls trance of unworthiness, the dynamics of how easy it is in a economic neoliberal capitalist world to feel inadequate because people are sort of taught and socialized to think that they need more and they should have high status and so on and so on. So I think the spirituality and mindfulness resources coming from Brach in relation to this feelings of unworthiness and guilt can be highly useful also in relation to what is sometimes called ecological guilt or climate guilt.
Yeah. What about the people who don't want anything with spirituality, but they could benefit from something maybe contemplative, right? The ones who are so deeply in the depression, they can't get out.
That's a very good question, and sometimes the situations can be very difficult. What I find important, for example, is this trauma-informed methodology coming from Elaine Miller-Karas and adapted into ecological matters by Bob Doppelt, for example, in his book Transformational Resilience. And these are fundamentally quite simple embodied body-mind practices, for example, like pushing a wall for 10 seconds intensively, and that already gets things moving in your body-mind. So there's things that one can do to shift attention away from these vicious circles related to very difficult mental states. Different breathing exercises, for example, the 5, 6, 7 breathing, where there's, counting to 5 when you breathe in, then holding your breath, counting to 6, and then breathing out, counting to 7, which again interrupts some of the systems in us and may help us to move forward from places where we are stuck. So luckily, there are these kinds of methods which are easily integrated into spirituality, but which can also be practiced without any explicit reference to any spiritual tradition.
I love that. Thank you, Panu. One last question before we close. At what point does an emotion become a mood and become someone's character?
Fascinating question again, and in emotion research, where I'm learning new things all the time, the phenomena related to longer term affects and feelings has been somewhat understudied when compared to more short-term emotional phenomena like affect, for example, and certain definitions of emotion. So moods on one hand refer to these longer temporal affective phenomena, but I think that there's also different kinds of these more longer affective phenomena. So for example, when thinking about the climate change and our relationship with that, there's some fundamental elements that may be included in a person's stance or attitude or disposition towards climate change. For example, there might be feelings of moral outrage and feelings of sadness and feelings of motivation to do something for the matters, and sometimes feelings of guilt. And so there's sort of these kinds of energies included in one's affective disposition, if we call it that way. It's a bit technical. And then there may be different kinds of moods. For example, during a given period, like a dark November in Helsinki, I personally, for example, have a lower mood simply because I am affected by seasons and the amount of light. And that, again, also can affect my climate emotions and moods and feelings, but it's not exactly the same as this sort of fundamental affective disposition towards climate change. And one metaphor that I've been using for this is related to weather and climate. So there may be larger scale climatic conditions and then regional weather and then local weather also. And that's a metaphor for different kinds of emotions, feelings, moods, affective phenomena. So this wasn't a very explicit answer to your question, but more like a testimony to the complexity of temporalities and phenomena in this regard.
Thank you. I remember I lived in Finland for 1 month, the whole month of December until early January. And maybe that was not the best time to visit.
That's a challenge to visit. So warmly welcome back again during summer sometime soon.
Yes. But I remember during that time, the breathing really helped because the serotonin levels just continue to drop. And I mean, this is our biology at that point. And so it's determining what's the mind and what's actually the body, what the environment. So I want to ask you so many more questions, but I know we're out of time. Before we go, Panu, if people want to hear more about your work, where can they find you?
So there's a personal website, www.panupihkala.fi. So there's information about the research and some practical things which are going on. Perhaps an easily accessible way is to listen to the podcast I've been hosting with environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty, provocatively titled Climate Change and Happiness. So we are trying to explore elements of good life or meaningful life amidst the climate crisis. So this podcast, Climate Change and Happiness, can be found on all the common podcast platforms. So that would be my recommendation. But my research is almost all open access. So online it's possible to find many kinds of things. And thank you for a wide-ranging and very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Panu.